After a long wait, Pikmin 4 finally released on the Switch last week, and most people seem to really like it. I know I'm having a great time playing through it as my first Pikmin experience. Regardless of how you feel about the specific changes or updates to the formula of the series in this sequel, most people can agree it is a beautiful game. You'll often see the comment, how is this running on the Switch? How did they get it to look like this? And that really is how it feels sometimes to play this game. It can be stunning. But how exactly did Nintendo manage to make the game look so good on the Switch's old hardware? What kind of tricks, camera effects, and optimizations did the developers use to make this possible? Here's what I think. First off, all of the props go to the designers, programmers, artists, and modelers who developed the art style and painstakingly crafted all of these amazing assets and models. The folks at Nintendo EPD who developed the game really put a lot of time and effort into crafting this world. And in an interesting first, Pikmin 4 was internally developed using Unreal Engine, which has a tremendously powerful graphics engine, and I'm sure this helped make the decision to use it for this title specifically. Pikmin 4's overall art style really reminds me of miniatures photography or toy photography, where the environment looks very detailed and highly rendered, while characters or creatures, which would be the toys or miniatures, have much simpler textures and shapes. They replicate this sort of aesthetic using lens effects that are common in macro or miniature photography. You generally want to use a long lens when doing this kind of photography. A lens with a short focal length is wide angle, and one with a long focal length, usually expressed in millimeters or mm, are usually used for portraits or to isolate subjects. The biggest result of a long telephoto macro lens in Pikmin 4 is the shallow depth of field. That basically means only a small sliver of distance from the camera is in focus at any given time. You'll notice anything far away or part of the background is heavily blurred, and even anything in the foreground close to the camera is also out of focus. This foreground blur also pulls double duty since it makes the HUD elements easier to see and it makes them stand out, which helps with legibility. This focuses in the player's attention to directly what is in front of them and creates a good sense of scale. You'll also notice in cutscenes and sometimes in gameplay something called Chromatic Aberration. That's those little red and white framed outlines of objects specifically on the borders of the screen. It's a small detail, but it's really interesting when you see it. In the real world, Chromatic Aberration most often happens at extremely short or long focal ranges. Normally, this is something you'd correct out of your photographs, but to create a more immersive physical camera experience in Pikmin 4, they actually add that effect in. It occurs when light waves that come in through the lens don't all land in the correct area once they get to the sensor. And you'll notice it on pulled back shots like when your ship is coming in or out of frame, or when you're far away from a subject. The other main way that I think Pikmin 4's world feels so real and tactile is the overall texturing. Both environments and living creatures feel like they have such real surfaces that you can reach out and touch them and know exactly how they would feel. The problem with creating very realistically textured things in video games has to do with geometry. I use an example from the Unity Game Development Engine's documentations page. If you want to add bolts to a sheet of metal, let's say on a ship or a plane, you can add small 3D models for every single one of those bolts. Multiplying that out thousands of times will increase the amount of polygons or true 3D shapes that your game needs to render, and it will basically blow out your performance, especially during complex scenes. What you can do instead is use normal maps or bump maps to tell the game engine to render different levels of height and light refraction on a surface without actually creating 3D objects in the world to bog down your performance. Basic texture on an object is an image file that tells the game the color and transparency of the exterior of a game object, nothing else. In game engines, you can then add multiple other textures or maps or image files that give the game engine more details on how to shade and render an object. For example, this is a stone texture and its corresponding bump map or normal map. This is how the stone wall would look with its basic albedo texture, flat. Then if you add the bump map, the engine can now render light and shading to that texture in a way that makes it seem much more realistic, even in other lighting conditions. You can build up on this and add even more, like detail masks for skin or specular maps to control shininess and reflectiveness on metal textures. It can get dizzying to think of the amount of effort that can go into making surfaces look good, and that attention to detail is definitely part of how Pikmin 4 looks so good, and the developers are proud of it too. You can spend tons of time just looking at and rotating the treasure models that you can collect in game. Finally, optimization practices help in reducing the performance demands of a game. This would then let you spend more console resources on making things pretty. Optimizations can include things like making the camera move rather slowly with no setting to increase the camera turning speed, so that you can more easily render and unrender objects when they come in and out of view. Managing how complex an object is rendered based on how far it is another thing that games do. You can often see this in trees. When you get really far away from them, they'll kind of just look like a picture in the distance, and 3D models can get a lot chunkier and blockier the further they are away from you, though you'll still see some pop in this game when you get close enough to objects. Overall, Pikmin 4 looks good because of its thoughtful use of real-world camera effects, dedicated textures and models, tremendous efforts in optimization, and ultimately a whole lot of hard work.